The House comes to questions for oral answer. Question number 1, in the name of James Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Transport and asks, why does his 10-year transport strategy make no mention of New Zealand's long-term target to reduce net greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2050?
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Simon Bridges.
Well, because the government doesn't follow some asinine paint-by-number approach where we value something merely on the number of times that it's put into a document.
Order. I can't hear the answer, so I can't rule whether the question's been addressed. Less interruption, particularly from my left.
What's very clear is that the government's 2015 policy statement on land transport has a clear objective that the land transport system mitigate its effects on the environment. It also makes clear that reducing greenhouse gas emissions from transport is an important consideration in land transport investment policy.
Supplementary.
Order. Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister, well, given that answer, can he tell the House by what percentage transport emissions would need to reduce from today in order to meet the target that New Zealand signed up to in Paris?
The Honourable Simon Bridges.
Well, Mr. Speaker, no, because it's an economy-wide a target that New Zealand has set through Paris, and that's the same for every country. Of course, transport has to play its part, and that's why we've got a comprehensive set of initiatives, whether it's unprecedented investment in public transport in this government policy statement, $1.2 billion over 3 years in rail and cycleways and actually in roads, because high-quality highways, as the members found out but doesn't like to refer to, actually reduce emissions because they result in smoother, more free-flowing traffic.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Well, then, if new motorways decrease transport emissions, as he just said, why have transport emissions increased by 60% in the last 25 years, during which time the government has built more motorways than ever before?
Speaker.
The Honourable Simon Bridges.
Because the economy's grown.
Order. Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Is he aware that NZTA's analysis that that new motorways decrease transport emissions assumed zero growth in the number of vehicles on the road, even once these new motorways are built?
The Honourable Simon Bridges.
Mr. Speaker, as I said, when the economy grows and you get more freight and more traffic, regardless of the modes, you see potentially increased emissions. I appreciate that the member, through reasons of ideology, dislikes the analysis, but the analysis is robust, and what it shows quite clearly is in relation to the Waikato Expressway, that expressway and its design results in fewer emissions.
Supplementary? Supplementary question, James Shaw.
What proportion of the $40 billion in the transport budget has he allocated in the next 10 years to lower carbon alternatives like public transport and cycling infrastructure, and what percentage has he allocated to building more roads?
The Honourable Simon Bridges.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I make clear, that's an entirely simplistic, asinine approach. If you go across the measures that we've got in public transport, unprecedented investment in this government policy statement. Cycleways, unprecedented investment throughout the major cities, the provinces and rural areas, electric vehicle policy and also the highways policy. We have a comprehensive suite of initiatives that is actually making a difference.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, James Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I seek leave to table this graph showing that the government is investing 90% of its transport budget in roading projects over the next 10 years.
Order.
And 11% in public transport, cycling and walking.
Who prepared the graph?
This was prepared by my office.
Yeah. And if the MEMA studies Speaker's ruling, he'll know that that's not authentic enough for me to put the leave to the House. Supplementary question?
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, James Shaw. Order. Order.
Given his previous answer, Mr. Speaker, by what percentage will transport emissions fall if he meets his target by 64,000 electric vehicles on the road by 2020?
The Honourable Simon
Mr. Speaker, if
Bridges.
the member puts down writing, I'm sure we can calculate it for him. But I'm glad that he recognises our policy in electric vehicles is more significant and ambitious than anything in the hot air that has come out of the Green Party.
Supplementary.
Order.
Oh, sorry, point of order,
Order.
Mr. Speaker. Point of order.
Point of order, James Shaw.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I seek leave to table analysis by Massey University's Ralph Sims showing that meeting the target of 64,000 electric vehicles would cut emissions
Order.
by
We don't need an
0.01.
explanation of it. All I need to know is whether it's freely available to members if they want it off the internet.
I didn't receive it via the internet, but it may be available on the internet.
Order. Order on the basis that the member hasn't checked to see whether it's available, and I implore members in the future, if they're going to table a document, take the time to, because that's a question that will be asked. I'll put the leave on this occasion. The House will decide. Leave is sought to table that particular analysis by Massey University. Is there any objection to it being tabled? There is objection.
3.
Order. 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 Mr. Little. Order. Supplementary question. Order. If I need to name a particular member as a last warning, I won't hesitate to do so. Supplementary question, James Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before he made the big announcement in February to spend $1.8 billion on the new east-west roading project in Auckland, what advice did he seek about its climate impact?
The Honourable Simon
Well, Mr.
Bridges.
Speaker, I didn't seek advice, but what I know is very clear is that the Transport Agency factors in carbon emissions into the economic evaluations on roads such as the east-west.
Supplementary question, David Seymour.
Does the strategy include anything on leading by example or parliamentary air travel?
In as far as this ministerial responsibility, the Honourable Simon Bridges.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think it should. In fact, I'm aware of one organisation, some might say quite hypocritically, who talks a big game but travels more and uses more air miles than anyone else that I know of.
Order. Question number 2.